fairies! Welcome or welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name's Maria and today's video is just going to be a video going through all of my winter recommendations. So books I think really make me think about winter and that kind of cold season. They may have kind of a cold setting, or it may just be that they're the type of books that I think are really good to binge around this time of year. And obviously I do mostly read fantasy, so a lot of my recommendations will be within that genre. So fantasy and romantasy are probably my most read genres, but I do have a few here that are kind of mystery and thriller. I do have some classics. I do have one or two romance on the list as well. It is a bit lacking, but there is one or two romance on here as well. So just be going through all of the books that I would recommend you read around this time of year, as well as some of the books that I actually have on my Winter TBR. So if you did watch my last video, you will have seen that I did just do a bit of a refresh on my TBR cart, and I basically just wanted to make sure that all of the wintry books that I want to read over the next few months are on here. And again, it may not be that they're necessarily set in winter, they're just books I think I will enjoy to read more in the cold, cozy season. So yeah, I'll go through all my recommendations first. There's quite a few here, so I probably won't go in depth in terms of what the books are about, but just give you a bit of an idea of what the storyline is and again the genre that they're in. And then again, I'll do the same with my TBR and the books that I want to read over the next few months. But yeah, without further ado, let's just get into the recommendations. The first book I want to recommend is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. This is by Heather Fawcett, and despite this cover, which is really pretty and kind of gives more spring vibes, this is definitely a book that would be good to read around the winter time because it's set in kind of Arctic Norway, so you kind of get those cold vibes from that. But basically in this one we're following Emily Wilde, who is trying to put together, as you may assume from the title, an encyclopedia of all the different types of fairies. So the types of fairies within this are definitely more of the traditional, maybe Celtic and folklore fairies, so it's not like the fae that we know from a lot of our romantasy. It's definitely more of that traditional vibe on it, and she's basically putting together this encyclopedia of all these different fairies, these different creatures, and as part of that she goes to this town in Arctic Norway to try and discover what is called the hidden ones. Now Emily isn't really the most personable person. She doesn't really like small talk, she's quite introverted, she likes to work alone, you know, so she doesn't really interact with a lot of the townsfolk, so the reception she gets there isn't really that warm because of her demeanour. However, her colleague Wendell Bambleby ends up turning up, who is one of these very charismatic, very extroverted people, and kind of rubs her up the wrong way. Obviously they start to work together and start to uncover the secrets of the hidden ones, and with this one it was just really enchanting, really whimsical. There is kind of a subplot of romance in there, but it's one of those quiet romances where it's not kind of grand gestures or anything like that, but it really does just grow over time. And I just really love the writing in this. It is written in kind of a diary entry form, so it's kind of Emily going through her days and things that they were doing, things they discovered and everything that happened, and I really enjoyed it. Really liked the writing, really liked the second book in this one as well, and I think the third book actually comes out next year, so good time to jump into this series because potentially you will be able to binge all three. But yeah, it has the setting, very whimsical, very cozy as well, and just all around a perfect winter read. Next up would be Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik, and again this is kind of set in quite a cold climate. You know, there's a lot of scenes where they're in the snow and things like that, so just going off that, it's a great book to read in the winter time. But this is kind of a Rumpelstiltskin retelling, and essentially we've got Miriam, who is the main character here, and her father is a debt collector, but he's not a very good one. Basically he ends up feeling sorry for a lot of the people within the town who owe him money, and they end up taking advantage of that. So Miriam decides to take it upon herself to go and collect the debts because her and her family are on the breadline, while other people within the town are benefiting from the fortune that they haven't returned to her father. So she ends up being pretty successful at this, and it starts rumours going around the town that she can turn silver into gold, and this captures the attention of the Winter King, who sets her an impossible challenge, and if she fails she will die, and if she triumphs she's not sure if that would be a fate worse than death. We do also have a couple of other storylines in here. We've got Irina, who is a noblewoman due to marry the Tsar. However, her betrothed holds a deadly secret, and that will become uncovered within the narrative. And as you go along, a lot of the storylines in here do converge, and I really enjoyed this. I do think this is a slower paced story, so there's not a lot of action, but as I say, in terms of the atmosphere, in terms of the story, and in terms of the character growth, character relationships, I really enjoyed this. And I love Naomi Novik's writing as well, so it is a bit more on the flowery side and a bit more on the purple prose side. But if you do enjoy that and you can enjoy a bit of a slower paced story, I definitely recommend this one because it was really good. And kind of in a similar strain to Spinning Silver, one I would recommend is one that I read recently actually, and that's The Burn the Nightingale by Catherine Arden. And obviously by the cover you can kind of tell this is perfect for the winter season. I believe it's called the Winter Night Trilogy as well, so kind of clues within the name. It's definitely a perfect trilogy to start within this winter season. And this one again is kind of just set in a very cold climate. It's a lot to do with kind of folklore, the winter Winter King is also present in here, and it's following this young girl Vasha who, when she is very young, she realises that she can see the house spirits that guard her home but no one else can see them, and it's really just following her along as she kind of navigates that. There's a lot in here about undercurrents of religion and self-reflection, and again I'd say this was a bit more of a slow-paced story that was a bit more slice of life than I was expecting. So it's set in medieval Russia, and it is just kind of going through what life was like for this family at this time, and I think the way it ends off, the next one will be a lot more magical. This one did have minimal kind of magical elements within there, but I still really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the writing, and as I say, I'll be excited to pick up the second one soon. Next up is The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern, and this is one I read in January this year, and it was quite lucky that I read it then, because again this is set in kind of the, I think it is actually set around January time as well, so you do kind of get that atmospheric setting that'll be perfect for this time of year. In this one we're following Zachary Rollins, who stumbles across a mysterious library book that basically has a story about his life within there, and he ends up going on a bit of a quest to figure out where this book came from, how it got to the library, who donated it, to figure out why details from his life are actually within there. And the journey to try and figure this out ends up bringing him to a secret club. There's kind of a labyrinth that's deep underground that most people don't know about, and a lot of this is just kind of unraveling the mystery around these places and these people and kind of why they're there, what the purpose is. I will say for a lot of this you're kind of reading it and it does get quite confusing at times. The way that the narrative is told is jumping between Zachary's point of view and then stories from the book that he's found, so sometimes the stories don't really make sense. It doesn't really make sense why they're being told, but as you get further into the book the stories do kind of link together and it all starts to fall into place. But it's one that you maybe need to give a bit of time just to make sure that you're following what the plot is. I ended up tabbing this one because I knew going into it that a lot of people had said it can get a little bit confusing at times, so I ended up tabbing it and highlighting it, and I ended up having a great time with this one. It's probably one of my top reads of the year. Gave it 5 stars, so I would definitely say give this one a try. And even though it's a book I think a lot of people have heard of, I don't know a lot of people who have actually read it, so yeah, bit of an underdog in this one, and one I think deserves a bit more hype. And since we're talking about books that I think deserve a bit more hype, I'll go to one of my more recent reads, and that is Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. And this one we're following Gideon, who is a orphan who has been brought up on this 9th planet her entire life. So within this world there are 9 different planets, and each of the heirs to these planets are necromancers. And Gideon had ended up on the 9th planet as a baby and has been brought up by nuns and skeletons for her entire life. She has also been planning to try and flee the 9th house for as long as she can remember, and one day one of her attempts fails and she ends up in the hands of Harrow, who is the heir to this 9th house. And through their discussions Harrow ends up roping Gideon in to become her cavalier, because she is basically going to be attending these trials on the first planet to become a lictor, which is basically someone who works directly with the Emperor, gets all this infinite power and becomes immortal. Gideon reluctantly agrees because Harrow says if she does this then she will allow her to flee, and the story kind of goes from there. This is another one where it is a little bit confusing as you're going through it. The narrative isn't quite straightforward, but what I will say with this one, I think as you're reading it you're much more present with what's going on in this one than say The Starless Sea. You can understand what's going on within the scene, but you may not understand the bigger picture with this one. But definitely really enjoyed this. I think it was really well written. The characters were fully fleshed out. Even the side characters who had minimal airtime in here had really full development, and it was really funny as well. I really enjoyed the audiobook for this one and definitely recommend listening to that while you're reading this one as well. It was just a really good audiobook and I just really loved the narration. She really brought the characters to life in this one. But yeah, I think just because this is set in space, a little bit dark, you know, skeletons and things like that, it's just something that would be good to read in the winter season. Next up is The Final Empire and kind of the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. So this is one that I have read. I've completed the trilogy, and this first book I think definitely is a great example of his writing and his work. In this one we're in a world that is kind of clouded in mists, it's very dark, very gloomy, and this is a story essentially, what if the villain had won? You know, what if the hero hadn't overtaken the dark ruler, and what if they were now ruling the world? And we basically have this street urchin Vin, who becomes part of this rebellion group, and she has to learn how to use allomancy to help overcome this dark ruler. And allomancy is basically the ingestion of metals, and different metals give you different powers. Certain people can ingest one metal and it will give them that power, and then others will be able to ingest multiple different ones, and I believe they're called the Mistborn. So really good trilogy. I would say that book 2 and 3 were a little bit disappointing for me, but this first book was a 5-star. Really loved it, and I think if you're trying to get into Brandon Sanderson it is a good place to start because it is quite simplistic. It's a 3-book series for a start. I think there is a second trilogy, but you can read the 3 books as a trilogy and the story is almost complete with that. And yeah, it was my first Brandon Sanderson and I really enjoyed it, and I'm actually going to be moving on to some of his other works. I just think the winter time is a great time to get into any epic fantasy fantasy like this, because you can really binge it, really get into the atmosphere of it and just kind of escape the doom and gloom of, although this is a bit gloomy, but yeah, you can kind of escape the real world and get really immersed in a different world. And yeah, I think Brandon Sanderson is a great example of an author that can provide that escape, and yeah, I think this would be a great series to start. Next up, I would say Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo, and most people have probably heard of this. There's a TV show for this one as well, and it's connected to the Shadow and Bone trilogy. But if you're not familiar with this, it's basically a story about a heist, and it follows Kaz Bracker, who has been given this opportunity to take part in this heist to retrieve a hostage who has knowledge about the Grishaverse, which is the setting, which could change kind of the magic system as they know it. And it basically is a story of misfits coming together to do this heist, and I think it has a convict with a thirst for revenge, a sharpshooter who can't walk away from a wager, a runaway with a privileged past, a spy known as the Wraith, a heartrender using her magic to survive the slums, and a thief with a gift for unlikely escape. So 6 dangerous outcasts, one impossible heist. Together they must be unstoppable if they don't kill each other first. And I think with this one, the heist story is really important in here. You know, it is kind of the premise for it, but for me it really is the characters, watching them come together, watching them kind of unravel their secrets. Most of them are quite guarded, and as you read this book and the second book, this is a duology, you do kind of see their characters open up and the development there. And I think for me that's what I really enjoyed about this, almost more the character study rather than just the premise. I mean, the premise and the plot and the world that it's built in are all really good and entertaining as well, but for me it really was the characters that helped me on in this duology. And yeah, if you haven't read this yet, if you think it's maybe a bit too YA, or if you think it's not something you're going to like because of the heist story, I would say just reconsider and maybe give it a try, because for me it was much more about the characters in this and watching their development over the duology. Next up, I would recommend Daughter of Smoke and Bone by Laini Taylor, and this one is kind of set in Prague, and again it just feels very dark and gloomy at the start in terms of the setting. In this one we're following Karu, who is a 17-year-old art student in Prague, and she's also working for chimera, or kind of creatures that have attributes to different animals, for her entire life, and for them she collects teeth, which is what they demand as payment for wishes within this world. However, Karu doesn't actually understand what the teeth are used for or why this is the price that they ask for, so that's part of the story that we have in here. And one day she comes across a seraph who is basically like an archangel called Akiva, who finds something familiar about her and can't really get her out of his head, and the story kind of goes from there. This one definitely has a lot of twists and turns and mysteries within here, and for me, just with Laini Taylor, her writing is absolutely stunning. I love the characters that she writes, I love the worlds that she builds, and yeah, she can do no wrong for me. So this is a 5-star series for me, and if you like urban fantasy, I think you'll definitely enjoy this one. And then speaking of urban fantasy, I would also recommend the Shadowhunter series by Cassandra Clare. Now, I'm obviously holding City of Bones. There's a couple of different reading orders that you can go by for this series. For me personally, I followed kind of, I think it might have been the publication order, but the first 3 in the Mortal Instruments, then the Infernal Devices, then back to the Mortal Instruments, Dark Artifices, and then the Last Hours trilogy. But you can also read it chronologically, so I believe you can start with the Infernal Devices, which is my favourite trilogy within the series. So I'll need to double check if you can start with that way, but I'm pretty sure you can start with those books because it's chronological in terms of the events, as they're set in Victorian England, whereas this series and this kind of part of the series is set kind of more in modern day, or modern day for when it was written. Basically, this series, if you haven't heard of it before, is an urban fantasy set around these shadow hunters, who are these people who were born with innate abilities to protect other humans from demons and vampires and werewolves and all things like that. And within each trilogy there's usually some sort of mystery or some sort of issue that they have to tackle and come together to do this. For me, what I would say about the Shadowhunter series is that the characters and the relationships, and especially the romantic relationships within here, are really, really elite, and they're really stories that are going to stick with me for a really long time. They are YA, so there's no spice or anything in here, so if that's something that you kind of look for within your books, you probably won't find it in these. But what I will say is the tension is so good. If you like forbidden romance, if you like love triangles, no one does it better than Cassandra Clare. Honestly, this series has taken me a little while to get through because there's 16 books out in the series so far, but I'm currently reading The Last Hours, which is the last 3 books in terms of the order that I've read them anyway, and I'm just going to be so sad when this is over. I think there is going to be another trilogy within this world, but I don't think there's been an announcement yet. But if you haven't started this series, if you were worried it was maybe too YA, I would definitely say, though the characters are young in here, a lot of what they're going through is very relatable, and a lot of the relationships have been written in here in such a way that even me as a 36-year-old woman human, can't relate to them. So again, if you like urban fantasy, this is definitely a series I would check out. Next up we have The Invisible Life of Addy, and this is by V.E. Schwab, and in this one we're following Addy in around, I think it's 1701 or something like that, and she's set to be married, but she doesn't want that for her life. She wants more for her life. She wants more from the little town that she lives in, and at the very start of the story she ends up making a deal with a demon for eternal life, thinking that this will give her obviously the opportunity to do all of the things that she wants to do. But the caveat for that is that no one will remember her. So a lot of this story is kind of watching Addy go through her life. It follows from 1701 right up to modern day, and it's her going through different scenarios and trying to build relationships, trying to build connections, but because no one remembers her, that's very difficult to do. And I think a lot of this is to do with kind of self-reflection, kind of what is a life if you don't have connections, if you don't have human connection, what does that mean? And I just think it was a really beautiful story. It was definitely making me self-reflect on things, and in terms of the writing, I love V. Schwab's writing as well, and this one is a little bit slower paced as well, so it's not one of those ones again where there's going to be action on every page. It is much more of a character study and kind of a human study, I would say, in terms of how we interact and how us as humans need other human interaction as well. So really love this one. It did have its day, you know, it kind of is a bit of a TikTok book as well, but I would say just to be cautious going into this one of thinking it's again kind of a whirlwind romance book. I don't think that's what this is. It is much more of a study on humans and how we interact and kind of what it means to be human, and it's just a really beautiful story, so highly recommend if you haven't read this yet. And then next up I will go through some of the ones that I think have a bit more of a romance feel to them. So the first one is again one that you probably will have heard of, and it's Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross. In this one we follow Iris Winnow, who has just become a journalist for a newspaper, and her brother has just been sent off to war, so she's obviously quite anxious about this, and she finds a typewriter that her grandmother gave her years ago before she died, and she starts to write letters to her brother to kind of tell him how her day went, tell him how she's worried about him. And what she doesn't know about the typewriter is it's actually magical, and the letters from that typewriter end up in the hands of Roman Kit, who is her rival at the paper, and the story kind of goes from there. This one is kind of said to be a fantasy. I would say that it's more magical realism in my opinion. There is mention of gods and kind of the war is between different gods within this world, but I think this is much more historical fiction with a little bit of magical realism in there. If you like anything that's kind of set around World War I, World War II, this will probably appeal to you, but the romance in here again is quite quiet, I would say, quite subtle, but definitely has a lot of impact. I would say the first book is my favourite over the second book. I do think that the second book was much more plot heavy and was trying to incorporate the gods a little bit more into this world, and it did work a little bit, but for me I definitely think the magic was in this first book. And if you like romance or you like historical romance, I think you'll definitely enjoy this one, even if you're not a fantasy reader, because the fantasy elements are pretty minimal within here. Next up we have One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig, and this is set in a town called Blunder, which basically has a dark force kind of infecting it at the moment, so very misty, very dark. Obviously the cover you can kind of see the vibes that you're getting there. And the main character in this is Elsbeth, who has been infected by this blight that is going around this town, and essentially she has a voice in her head that she calls Nightmare. He kind of tells her what to do and tries to keep her safe. Now within this land we do have a magic system that revolves around cards, kind of like tarot cards. There's 12 different cards that if you tap them you can wield the power from that card. So power isn't something that you're born with. These cards kind of hold all of the power of the town, and essentially if someone gets all 12 of those cards within their possession, they have the potential of being very powerful but also very dangerous. So basically along the way Elsbeth runs into a highwayman who she ends up reluctantly allying with, and they go on a quest to try and absolve this blight that has been infecting Blunder, and the story kind of goes from there. I think with this one again it's just very atmospheric. This one is definitely more of a vibes over plot story, so there is enough plot in there, but I think for me what I found with this was it was definitely the vibes of this that I was really enjoying. I really liked the characters, I liked the romance in this one, loved the romance in the second book for this series, and yeah, I just think in terms of the atmosphere and the setting in this one, winter is the perfect time to read this. And then lastly for my fantasy recommendations, and this is again it kind of has a more romance heavy plot, is Guild by Raven Kennedy. So this one is kind of a King Midas retelling. We've got our main protagonist Orient, who is basically a concubine for the King Midas, and within this King Midas rescued Orient and she kind of feels a debt to him. You know, she knows that he's doing everything to keep her safe. She's locked away in High Bell Castle, which is at the top of the snowy mountains, and for all intents and purposes she is very grateful to Midas for what he has done for her. However, everything she knows starts to change at one one point within this, and the story really does unravel from this first book. I will say this first book wasn't my favourite. I think I rated this 3 stars, but it is very much a bit of a prequel to the main series, and the real story I would say starts from book 2. But I would say this is still a really good story. It is a good introduction to it. It's not bad writing or anything. I just didn't enjoy kind of the first maybe 50% of it. I didn't really understand why the protagonist was doing what she was doing, but definitely as you go through the series you will see that the character development is phenomenal in this. And yeah, I just think this is a great romantasy if you're wanting to start a new series and really binge it. This is completed now. There's 6 books in the series, so you could completely binge the entire series. And in terms of the romance, I really enjoyed the romance in this one, and there's a couple of different romances that go on throughout the series, so definitely enough to keep you entertained. But yeah, if you're looking for a new romantasy to pick up, I think winter is a great time to pick this one up. So next up, a couple of mystery / thrillers that I have to recommend, and the first one would be The Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. So I'm sure you've heard of Agatha Christie. She's one of the most prolific thriller writers or mystery writers that there probably has ever been, but Murder on the Orient Express is the only one that I've read by her, and I really enjoyed it. I read it about a year ago now, and I really enjoyed the story. So basically in this one, the Orient Express is derailed by an avalanche, and one of the passengers ends up dead, and basically Hercule Poirot has to solve the case before the killer strikes again. And yeah, again, just kind of a very formulaic mystery. It definitely kept me guessing. Quite a quick read for me. I don't think it's too long either. I listened to the audiobook, so that may be why it didn't take me too long to read through, but I really enjoyed it, and I just think for this time of year, definitely with the setting that it has, it'd be a great time of year to read that one. And then this one is kind of dark academia, kind of mystery, kind of thriller. It's If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio, and again I read this in January this year, and it was a perfect setting for this. But in this one we follow a group of students who are in university studying Shakespeare, and one of their friends ends up dead, and Oliver Marks is part of that group, and he's just come out of prison after spending 10 years there for that murder. However, was he the culprit? What really happened? How did their friend die? That's kind of the story that you're following within this one, and again, just very atmospheric. Definitely kept me guessing, and a lot of this was kind of a character study within the group. And I do think that a lot of people have shied away from this because they've heard there's a lot of Shakespeare language within here, and I don't think you need to have a knowledge of Shakespeare at all to read this. I mean, I've read a few of his plays, but I'm definitely not a Shakespeare expert at all, and I don't think it took away from my enjoyment of this. I really enjoyed the writing style, really enjoyed the story. So yeah, if you're looking for something that's a bit dark academia / mystery thriller, this is a great one to pick up. Next up is the singular romance that I have on this list, and I would definitely say if you do have any romance recommendations that are specifically winter related, put them in the comments below, because when I was trying to think, I really couldn't think of any, or at least I haven't read them if there are any. But the one that I have read is Love Life Farms by B.K. Borison, and this one we follow Stella, who is running this Christmas tree farm, so perfect for this season, and it is kind of failing. She ends up entering this competition with an influencer called Evelyn St. James, and when Evelyn comes to kind of look at her Christmas tree farm, she mistakenly believes that Stella and her best friend are in a relationship, and they end up kind of fake dating to help with the image of this farm. They're entering this competition to win some money, and friends to lovers, miscommunication, fake dating trope, it's all in there. So these are kind of rom-com novels, and I really enjoyed this one. I think it was really light-hearted. There was a few things that are a bit annoying in there in terms of that miscommunication trope, but it kind of goes with these romance novels. There is always going to be something like that in there, but I just really enjoyed the characters, really enjoyed the romance. Definitely a really great palette cleanser for anyone like myself who reads a lot of fantasy. It was really great to kind of break out from that, and just really enjoyable. I think if it was like a movie or something like that, you could equate it to one of those Christmas Hallmark movies. It was just really good, really heartwarming, and overall, yeah, I really enjoyed it. And then last up are 3 of the classics that I want to recommend. So the first one would be Jane Eyre, and I reread this recently. The first time I read this I was around 15, and I reread it a couple of months ago, and I think this is a great book for either autumn or winter. It kind of has that dark atmosphere. It's a bit more gothic in terms of the writing style, and there is a bit of a mystery thriller element in here as well. And in this one we kind of follow Jane Eyre, who at a very young age is orphaned and ends up living with her aunt and uncle. Now when her uncle also passes away, her aunt ends up mistreating her, and she has kind of a really hard start in life, but Jane is quite tenacious, and she's very opinionated, and she's very stubborn as well, so you kind of see the fire within her personality from a very young age. But she ends up going to this school for kind of wayward children, and from that she ends up getting an education and becoming a governess for Mr. Rochester, and the story kind of goes from there. But I'm sure you've heard of Jane Eyre before, but if you haven't read it, I would definitely say this is one of the more approachable classics. In terms of the writing style, it definitely doesn't feel like it was written when it was, and as I say, because of the mystery thriller element of it, I think it definitely keeps you entertained. It's a lot more action packed than a lot of the classics that I've read, so definitely kept me enthralled and kept me entertained, and it's probably one of my favourite classics. And I don't think I mentioned it's written by Charlotte Bronte. And next up is a book written by Charlotte's sister, Emily Bronte, so Wuthering Heights. And again, this is probably one that you've heard of, and the basic synopsis of this is it follows an anti-hero, Heathcliff, who seeks to get revenge on everyone who kept him from the love of his life, Cathy. Now, this isn't a romance. It's very toxic, very controversial, and it was kind of controversial because there's a lot of dealing with mental health in here, mental and physical cruelty as well, and I think for the time it was extremely controversial because the way it's told is quite stark. So definitely don't go into this thinking that you're going to get this whirlwind romance or anything. It is much more about that side of things, and you shouldn't really root for anyone within this book, but it's a really good story. Again, very gothic, set in the Yorkshire moors and very misty, very atmospheric setting, so perfect time of year to read this. I actually read this in the summer initially, but definitely want to reread this in the colder months, and I may try and put it on my TBR for this year. The lighting may have changed a little bit, but I ended up putting the light on because it's starting to get a little bit dark. Despite it being 3:30 in the afternoon, it's already starting to get dark. And then last up for the classics is Anak Coran, and this one is kind of, when you're asked about the synopsis of this one, it is centering around Anak Coran, who has an adulterous affair with a new count who comes to town. There's a young bachelor called Count Fronsky, and while that is kind of part of the narrative within here, I definitely don't think that's the centre of this plot. For me, this is much more a social commentary on the time in Russia, so I think this was written around 1875 or something like that, and for me a lot of this was just social commentary on the state of Russia, kind of how things were going, commentary on the poor, on the rich, on the middle class, and it was quite slow going. This is definitely a lot more slice of life. It's quite a long book, as you can see, so for me I kind of read this in snippets. I didn't binge it or anything. I read like little bits each day, just to, I think it maybe took me about 2 or 3 weeks to get through on the side of my other reads, because I think if you do try and binge it, it probably would feel quite slow. Quite a lot in here that, as I say, it's much more centered around that social commentary and it's not really centering around the plot. But I did end up really enjoying this. I ended up giving it 4 stars. It wasn't 5 stars, as I say, because there were quite big chunks in here that were incredibly slow, but they were still interesting and I did still enjoy them, but it wasn't one that I think I would want to reread over and over again. I think it could be a one and done once I've read it. I'm not sure if I would read it again, but I've definitely watched the movies, or if there was a TV show on it I would watch it as well, because I did enjoy the story. I enjoyed the characters in here. There is kind of a wide cast of characters that you follow, so it's not just Anak Coran in it, and I wouldn't even say that she's the main character within this either, but a bit less approachable just because of the length, but I think in terms of the writing style, this is still a very approachable classic to read. So that's everything for the recommendations. So I think now I'll just go through some of my TBR for the winter months as well. So I'm not going to go deep into the synopsis or anything. I'll probably just mention what they are, maybe give a very brief description of what I think they're about. But the first one would be Bear Time by Frederick Backman, and this one was very kindly sent to me by my good friend Gina on bookstagram, so I'll put her bookstagram in the description below. But basically she sent me this for my birthday, and this is one that's definitely been on my radar. I think it's something to do with kind of this town that has a big hockey team presence. Something happens within the town that makes people kind of divided in their allegiance, and that's all I really know about it, but I just heard really great things about it. These Violent Delights, I believe, is an urban fantasy. I believe it's based on kind of 2 warring, almost like mafia-like families. Has a bit of a Romeo and Juliet setting. It is one that's been on my TBR for quite some time, and as it's urban fantasy I just think winter is a great time to read it, and I just need to read it to see if it's something that I like, because I have quite a lot of Chloe Gong's books on my shelf, so just want to see if her writing is for me, and if not, it just means I can qualify it out. But heard some good things about this, heard some not so good things about this, so a little bit hesitant going into this one, but definitely think I'm going to try and read this one really soon. Next up is Blood Hour by Emily Wen Zhao, and this one, I think I mentioned it in my last video, but basically follows a character who has been accused of her father's murder. She's trying to kind of clear her name and then also seek revenge on the people who committed the murder, and again I think it's just set in a kind of wintry atmospheric setting, so definitely want to pick this up while it is still winter. Next up is a classic, and it's The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and this is by Anne Bronte. So I'm thinking, I really loved Charlotte Bronte's book, I really loved Emily Bronte's book, I really should read Anne Bronte's book, because if it's in the same kind of vein I may end up enjoying it. And this one we follow a character who turns up at this Wildfell Hall, quite mysterious. We've got another person who ends up kind of falling in love with her, there's dark secrets, and it just sounds like it's going to be a really good read, and I think if it is in the same strain as those other books it's probably going to be pretty approachable as well, so excited to read this one to see what I think. And then in terms of just what's on my cart, there's quite a few here that I'm hoping to get to. So The Bonesmith by Nikki Powell Preto, that has been hailed as Gideon the Ninth mixed with Game of Thrones, 2 stories that I absolutely love, so hoping to pick that up. I do also have Book of Night by Holly Black. Again, heard mixed things about that one, so I'm a little bit apprehensive of picking that one up, but I do think just going by kind of the synopsis of it and the story, the wintertime would be a good time to read it. I also have The Ninth Rain by Jen Williams, and this is one that I haven't really heard anybody talking about. I heard someone say that this is kind of like Six of Crows but better, so if it is like Six of Crows then it's definitely one I want to be picking up. And then yeah, a few on here I have just A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab. I think that would be really atmospheric to read. I have Jade City, again a lot of urban fantasies, that's kind of what I turn to around this time of year. I have a few on here that I obviously have just wanted to pick up for quite some time, and a few that have been on my TBR for a really long time as well. But yeah, I don't know about you, but I'm definitely a bit of a seasonal reader, so it probably will be mostly fantasy, mostly romantasy, mostly kind of more gothic and dark stories, but really excited to hopefully get to some of these really soon and to hopefully get some of them off my physical TBR, because as I say, a lot of them have been on there for a really long time. I think that's everything for today's video. Definitely let me know your winter reading recommendations in the comments below. Let me know if there's any books that you think I should be trying to read, or as I say, definitely let me know if there's any romances you think are great for reading in the winter. Most of the romances I think of, they're usually a bit more summery or like kind of springtime, but if there's any winter recommendations you have, definitely put them in the comments below, because I'd love to kind of add to my list. And let me know what you're prioritising this winter, and are you a seasonal reader? Do you tend to read according to the season, or does it just depend what you're in the mood for? But yeah, definitely let me know what reads you're prioritising in the next few months. If you like this video, do remember to give it a like, and if you want to see more from me, remember to subscribe. I'm posting 2 videos per week, and it's videos like this, so book recommendation videos, book hauls, reading vlogs, book shopping videos, all good bookish things like that. Other than that, thanks so much for watching this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one soon. Bye!